everybody, welcome back to the YouTube channel. Don O'Loughlin from Don Shoots here. Following on from the last video I made, I actually got a request from Lazy Boy Photography who wanted to learn a bit more about shooting in manual mode. So for those of you who don't know, manual mode basically is when you get your new camera and you take it out of auto mode and you start playing around with all the different settings so that you can create what we want in photography, a perfect exposure. So to jump right in, there are three things you want to keep in mind when you talk about manual mode. That's ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now these might sound very technical, but hopefully with the explanation from today, you'll take away some good information about how to control those. So if you actually look at your camera, at the very back here in the camera body, there's a sensor. And it's that sensor that picks up all of the light that's coming into the camera that creates the image. And once you start shooting in manual mode, you get to control what happens to that light as it comes in. So you can say if it's going to be bright, if it's going to be dark, what's going to be in focus. And once you grasp the concept behind manual mode, you will be able to achieve better photographs. So as you take your camera out and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to go take a photo over there, and you're like, okay, we're in manual mode, and you want to increase the ISO or whatever it is, you come along and boom, you take your photo. So basically what's happened there is a whole bunch of light has come through the lens and hit the sensor. So the first thing we're going to talk about right now is ISO. Alright, jumping in really quick. ISO. And my best way of explaining it is using the busy bee concept. So if you can imagine at the back of your camera on the sensor there's a whole bunch of bees. And these bees are trying to collect light for your photograph. So try to think of ISO as bees at the back of your camera collecting light. So if you stick your ISO to 100, that means there are 100 light collecting bees at the back of your camera. Now, if you want to make your picture a bit brighter, then you'll increase the ISO to 200, 400, 800, 1600, whatever it is. And that means there's more bees at the back of the camera collecting light, so it makes it brighter. Now, if you want to make it a brighter image, that's great. However, also bear in mind that the more bees that are at the back of your camera on the sensor collecting light, well, that space is going to get very busy and it creates a grainy, almost sandy look in the image. Now, some photographers love this and this is their style. They go for a very grainy image, but other photographers like to keep it as sharp as possible. So that graininess is referred to as noise. So the higher the ISO number on your camera, well, the more noise you're going to get. So if you're trying to go for a very sharp, crisp image, you're going to have to bring your ISO as low as possible and then take the other measurements to increase the amount of light coming through the lens and hitting the back of the sensor so that you create a nice sharp image. And to achieve that, we're now going to talk about the next step in the exposure triangle, which is shutter speed. Alright, moving on. Hope you enjoyed the bit on ISO. Next thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. And shutter speed is one of the easiest things to comprehend, but it's also one of the things where you have to be very, very careful, because if you've got a shaky hand or a shaky camera, you're going to end up with a very shaky image. Now, to give you a broad picture of the whole thing, shutter speed basically refers to when you press down the button to take a photo, how long the shutter takes to go up and down and allow light in the lens to hit the sensor at the back of your camera. Okay, so if we were to leave the shutter speed here at 1.3 seconds, you're going to hear how long it takes for that shutter to go up and down. That was pretty slow. So with that, a lot of light came in, but if my hand is shaky, well, you're also going to see that shakiness in the image. So if you got shaky images after taking them, well, check out your shutter speed. Now, if we were to do the same thing again, but bring our shutter speed all the way down to 1,000th of a second, listen to this. You see how quick that is. You can even hear how fast it is. So in that scenario, with the shutter speed open for just 1,000th of a second, not much light actually comes in to hit the sensor. So if you're out and you're taking photos of sports and athletes and you want to make sure that you freeze the picture in time, you're probably going to want to use a very fast shutter speed. But if you're out doing nighttime photography where there isn't much light around, but you want to make sure that the sensor picks up on everything it can, well, you're going to use a very slow shutter speed. So those are two different scenarios where you'll either do a very long shutter speed or a very short shutter speed. Really, really fast. Bonus tip on shutter speed. A lot of people, when they're taking photos, they worry about the shakiness if they are doing a shutter speed. And as a general rule, if you're out shooting on a 50mm, you're going to want to keep your shutter speed higher than your focal length. What does that mean? If you're shooting with a 50mm lens, keep your shutter speed at 1/60th of a second and above. And if you're doing handheld, that should work out pretty well. Similarly, if you're shooting on an 85mm lens and you're using handheld, if you keep your shutter speed above 1/100th of a second or 1/90th of a second, if your camera allows it, well then you shouldn't get a shaky image. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. Try and keep your shutter speed right above your focal length when you're doing handheld photos to avoid shaky images. No one wants to see your shaky images. And then last but not least, and probably the most beautiful part of the exposure triangle if you're trying to create really cool images, is aperture. And aperture basically refers to the, I can't remember if it's 8 or 16. Someone's going to call me out on this, but hey, leave it in the comments. I appreciate the feedback. Aperture refers to the 8 or 16 blades that are inside your camera like that, and you can either make them smaller or you can make them bigger. Okay? So going back to our concept of light coming through the lens and hitting the sensor. If the aperture is bigger, well, more light is going to get in. But if the aperture is smaller, then less light is going to get in. So depending on what aperture you're using, this is going to dictate what you're going to do with your ISO and your shutter speed to make sure you get a good exposure. Scenarios where you might want to use an aperture of a low number like f1.8 would be you're trying to create a certain focal point, like say a portrait shoot. So if you've got a aperture all the way down to f1.8 and you want to create that nice blurry effect around the subject, you will pick out a focal point on the person and make sure that the camera is reflecting that focal point. However, if you want to take a photo of a landscape or nighttime photography where you want everything in focus, well then you're going to change your aperture all the way up to a number of say f16. So it's actually going to be closed nice and tight, but everything is going to be in focus. I know it's counterintuitive that if it's closed all the way down, how come everything's in focus? And if it's opened all the way up, you can create certain focal points. So bear in mind, if your aperture is closed all the way down to an f of 16, you might have to start increasing your ISO. Or maybe you're going to have to increase your shutter speed to allow more light to come in and hit the sensor. However, if you're doing an aperture of f1.8 where those blades are opened all the way up, well, in that case, you might actually have to decrease your ISO and also decrease your shutter speed, because then you might get too much light coming in. Okay, so hopefully those insights today gave you a bit more information about how to shoot in manual mode on your digital camera. Now, alright guys, as a bonus tip here at the very end of the video, I just want to speak really quickly about histograms. Because if you really want to understand the concept behind shooting in manual, well, it's great to know what a histogram is and what it represents, and this will definitely help you shoot better photographs. So the histogram is this tiny little box in the right hand corner. Now if I click here and I increase my ISO, watch what those lines do. They start moving to the right, okay? And that's basically saying, as we get to the middle, that there's more light coming in. So as it starts skewing all the way to the right, you can see that my image is overexposed. It's very bright. And as it skews all the way to the left, you can see that my image is quite a bit darker and it's now underexposed. Now, when you're playing with histograms, as a photographer, basically what you're aiming for is you want the histogram to sit somewhere like this, right smack in the middle, this kind of beautiful mountain effect. You'll notice that it's actually coming all the way up to a certain point, and that basically means that one particular color in the image is clipping. And that's something that can be corrected in post if you're using Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever it is you have. But just try to avoid being underexposed and being overexposed. So that's a small little tip on histograms and how you can interpret them so you can take better photos. Okay, so that's this week's video. I hope you got some good insights on how you can take better photos in manual mode using your digital SLR. If you like, well, give a like. If you're interested to hear more, well, hit the subscribe button and follow along. If there's something you want to see next time, leave it in the comments. Please do share. And now it's time for the outro. Okay, buddy.